The internet whispers about screams and violent arguments shattering the cold desert night, but the official police records reveal something far more terrifying: absolute, suffocating silence. There were no shattered windows. There were no desperate cries for help echoing through the Catalina Foothills. The neighbors heard absolutely nothing. The rumors of a loud confrontation before the disappearance are completely false, fabricated by online spectators desperate for a simple explanation. The truth is that an 84-year-old woman vanished into the thin air of the Arizona night without disturbing a single leaf on her property. She left behind no physical struggle, no ransom note on the counter, and no immediate witnesses to her abduction. Instead of a chaotic crime scene, investigators found a digital ghost town. They found a timeline meticulously recorded by silicon and wireless signals, a timeline that ends with a chilling technological death. At exactly 2:28 a.m., the Bluetooth connection between her life-saving pacemaker and her smartphone was permanently severed. That severed connection is the loudest sound in this entire case. It is a silent scream recorded only by a server miles away. This was not a random break-in. This was a perfectly scheduled digital execution. To understand how a human being can evaporate while leaving their digital shadow behind, you have to follow the data. That is exactly what we do here. If you want to track the digital forensics of the most baffling cases alongside me, hit subscribe and join True Crime with Liam as we secure this case file. We are looking at a crime that redefines how we think about home security. We are looking at a predator who understood that you do not need to silence a victim if you can silence their network first. The authorities walked into a house that looked perfectly normal to the naked eye, but to a digital forensic expert, it was a slaughterhouse of disconnected devices and wiped memory banks. The question is not just who took her, but how they managed to make an 84-year-old woman disappear while slipping through the cracks of a surveillance web designed to catch absolutely everything. When someone vanishes without a physical trace, the only way to find them is to look at the invisible signals they left behind. An 84-year-old woman living alone in the modern world is often surrounded by invisible tethers meant to keep her safe. Nancy Guthrie was a walking digital map. She did not drive herself around the sprawling city of Tucson. Instead, she relied entirely on ride-sharing applications like Uber to navigate her daily life, leaving a global positioning system breadcrumb trail every time she stepped out of her front door. More importantly, her very heartbeat was monitored and broadcasted through the airwaves. Her physical survival depended on a pacemaker that constantly communicated with a smartphone application via a Bluetooth signal. Every beat of her heart was a data point. Every movement was a logged event in a corporate server. You must understand this extreme reliance on technology to grasp the sheer impossibility of her physical disappearance. An individual completely enveloped in a digital safety net cannot simply walk away unnoticed. If she fell, the devices would know. If she wandered off, the tracking would locate her. Her physical body might have been fragile, but her digital presence was loud and robust. On the evening of January 31st, the digital logs show a perfectly ordinary routine. At 5:32 p.m., she took an Uber to have dinner at the home of her daughter. It was a normal family gathering. Hours later, at 9:48 p.m., her son-in-law brought her back to her home in the Catalina Foothills. He watched her go inside. The digital footprint confirms this mundane end to the day. At exactly 9:50 p.m., the heavy mechanical gears of her garage door whirred to life and the door closed shut. That closing garage door was the final confirmed physical barrier between the victim and the outside world. It was the last moment she was definitively known to be safe and secure inside her own fortress. A house with a closed garage, an active pacemaker, and a sleeping resident should be an impenetrable sanctuary. The neighborhood was quiet. The desert air was still, but inside that sealed house, the illusion of safety was already fracturing. The gears of the garage door grinding to a halt was the final ordinary sound that the house would ever produce. While the physical doors were locked tight against the night, a different kind of window was about to be forcefully shattered by someone who knew exactly how to navigate the invisible web surrounding her. The quiet was not a sign of peace. The quiet was the sound of a trap being slowly and meticulously set around a woman who had no idea her digital armor was about to be stripped away. The Catalina Foothills are known for their sprawling properties and isolated estates, making physical surveillance by neighbors inherently difficult. The houses are set far back from the street, shrouded by desert landscaping and thick darkness once the sun goes down. This geographical isolation made her technological connections even more critical. Her smartphone was not just a convenience. It was her primary lifeline to emergency services, to her family, and to the medical professionals who monitored her cardiac health from afar. Anyone plotting against her would have to realize that attacking her meant attacking a sophisticated network of real-time data transmission. They would have to be intimately familiar with how a Bluetooth signal behaves when separated from its host device. They would have to understand the exact radius of connectivity. They would need to know the layout of the house, not just in terms of walls and doors, but in terms of wireless dead zones and camera angles. The individual who targeted this home was not a common burglar looking for loose jewelry or cash. They were a predator calculating the exact intersection of physical vulnerability and technological blind spots. The garage door clicking shut at 9:50 p.m. meant the perimeter was secure. But a secure perimeter only matters if the threat is strictly on the outside. As the minutes ticked closer to midnight, the silence inside the house grew heavier. The morning of February 1st broke over Tucson, with the same relentless sunshine as any other day, completely ignorant of the void that had opened up in the Guthrie home during the night. Sunday mornings for the victim were structured by faith and routine. She was a woman of habit, and her attendance at her local church was an unwavering pillar of her weekly schedule. So, when the clock struck 11:56 a.m. and her pew remained empty, the first quiet alarms began to ring in the minds of her family members. It was not like her to simply oversleep or skip a service without notifying someone. A missed appointment for a woman in her 80s with a heart condition is never just a scheduling error. It is a siren. Driven by a rising sense of panic, her family rushed to the Catalina Foothills property to check on her. They arrived at the house expecting to find her, perhaps feeling unwell or dealing with a minor medical emergency. Instead, they found a scene that defied all logical explanation. They pushed open the doors and stepped into a void. At exactly 12:03 p.m., the frantic call to emergency dispatchers was made. First responders arrived to a house that was completely empty of human life, yet pregnant with the ghosts of interrupted routines. The interior of the home did not look like the aftermath of a violent struggle. There was no overturned furniture. There were no smashed vases or frantic claw marks on the walls. It looked as though she had simply evaporated into the arid Arizona air. But the devil in this case is entirely in the details left behind. Her essential personal belongings, the items a person would never willingly abandon if they were leaving on their own accord, were still sitting exactly where they belonged. Her purse remained in the house. Her keys were untouched. Most chillingly, her daily medications, the very chemical compounds required to keep her fragile body functioning, were left sitting on the counter. An 84-year-old woman, heavily reliant on a pacemaker, does not voluntarily pack a bag for a spontaneous trip without taking the medication that keeps her heart beating. This was not a runaway situation. This was a forced extraction. The quiet order of the living room was a terrifying facade that shattered the moment investigators stepped outside to examine the exterior perimeter. Right there on the front porch, stark against the concrete, was the physical evidence that turned a missing persons case into a dark and sinister mystery. Investigators discovered a blood stain. Subsequent forensic testing would later confirm the terrifying truth. The blood matched the DNA profile of the victim. This single red stain was the only physical crack in the otherwise perfect illusion of a quiet disappearance. It was a glaring red flag waving in the desert wind, indicating that whatever happened in the early hours of the morning involved physical trauma. Someone had bled on that porch, and that someone had vanished. The sheer contradiction between the pristine interior and the blood-stained exterior baffled the first responders on the scene. How could a person be violently abducted, bleeding onto the front step, without leaving a single trace of a struggle inside the house where they lived alone? The blood meant violence. The abandoned medication meant suddenness. The silence of the neighborhood meant the perpetrator was incredibly fast and horrifyingly efficient. The family stood on the lawn, staring at a house that had transformed from a sanctuary into a crime scene overnight. The local authorities immediately taped off the property, their boots crunching on the gravel as they began the tedious process of documenting the nothingness. They scoured the property line, looking for dragged footsteps or discarded clothing, but the desert dirt offered no answers. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, mocking the detectives with its immaculate preservation of a life that was suddenly and violently interrupted. Every untouched pillow and neatly folded towel screamed that something was deeply wrong. The physical evidence had hit a brick wall almost immediately, leaving investigators desperate for a thread to pull. If the physical world refused to give up the secrets of that night, they had only one other place to look. When physical forensics failed to tell the story, modern investigators must turn to the digital witnesses that never sleep. The detectives zeroed in on the security perimeter of the home, specifically the internet-connected Nest doorbell camera mounted near the front entrance. This device was supposed to be the unblinking eye protecting the property. But when law enforcement attempted to pull the footage from the early hours of February 1st, they found a terrifying blind spot. The camera had not malfunctioned. It had been purposefully and manually disconnected. The log files showed that the feed went entirely black at exactly 1:47 a.m. This was not a power outage. This was a calculated strike against the surveillance system. The perpetrator knew exactly where the camera was and how to disable it. But criminals often underestimate the redundancy of modern technology. The local police called in the Federal Bureau of Investigation to assist with the digital footprint. The federal agents did not just look at the camera itself. They dug deep into the back-end servers, managed by Google, sifting through the fragmented data packets that were transmitted in the milliseconds before the device was permanently blinded. Their forensic digital reconstruction yielded a single, horrifying frame of video. It was an image that would haunt the investigation. The recovered frame showed a male figure emerging from the pitch-black darkness of the desert night. He was dressed for hunting a human being. The suspect was completely obscured, wearing a dark mask that swallowed his facial features and heavy gloves to prevent leaving fingerprints on the smart device. Slung over his shoulders was a black Ozark Trail hiker backpack, likely carrying the tools of his grim trade. But the most chilling detail of all was how he illuminated his work. He had a flashlight shoved horizontally into his mouth, gripping it between his teeth so he could keep both of his gloved hands entirely free. In that final recovered frame, the suspect is captured mid-motion, his hand reaching out aggressively toward the camera lens to smother the electronic eye. He is staring directly into the lens, a phantom rising from the gravel, mere seconds before he plunged the entire property into total darkness. From 1:47 a.m. onward, the house was utterly blind. The electronic shield had been breached. Whatever nightmare unfolded next, it happened entirely off camera, cloaked in the artificial blindness created by the intruder. Look at the description of that recovered frame and imagine waking up to find that monster standing on your front porch. Hit the like button on this video right now if the thought of that masked figure reaching for your camera sends a shiver down your spine. That frozen image is the absolute peak of visual terror in this case. It proves that this was not a crime of passion or a sudden robbery gone wrong. This was a highly tactical, premeditated infiltration by someone who came prepared to operate in the dark, disable the alarms, and remove an 84-year-old woman from her home without waking the neighbors. The flashlight in the mouth speaks volumes about his need for speed and efficiency. He needed his hands free to work fast. The black backpack suggests he brought supplies, perhaps zip ties, duct tape, or specialized tools to breach the doors. He was a professional nightmare, and as the clock ticked past 1:47 a.m., he had complete control over the environment. The sheer audacity of walking directly up to an active recording device demonstrates a terrifying level of confidence. The suspect did not try to sneak through a back window or avoid the camera field of view. He approached it head-on, knowing he could defeat the technology before an alert could be effectively processed and responded to by law enforcement. He beat the machine in a foot race against the internet transmission speed. The house was now an isolated island in a sea of darkness, cut off from the watchful eyes of the digital cloud, leaving the sleeping victim completely at the mercy of the phantom with the flashlight in his teeth. The chilling discovery of the recovered camera frame shifted the entire paradigm of the investigation. The authorities were no longer looking for a wandering senior citizen. They were actively hunting a dangerous predator. The Pima County Sheriff officially confirmed what the evidence had already whispered. This was a targeted kidnapping. The declaration sent shockwaves through the normally quiet community of the Catalina Foothills. The protocol for a stranger abduction demanded that investigators first clear the inner circle, working their way outward from those closest to the victim. Naturally, The intense glare of the investigative spotlight swung directly onto the last person definitively known to have seen the victim alive. Her son-in-law, who had dropped her off at 9:48 p.m., was immediately subjected to rigorous questioning. In true crime, the last person to see the victim is always the primary focus of the initial inquiry. Detectives scrutinized his timeline, parsed his statements, and looked for any microscopic fractures in his alibi. However, the forensic reality of his innocence quickly became apparent. Through comprehensive digital tracking and verified alibis, law enforcement officially and permanently cleared the son-in-law and the rest of the immediate family from any suspicion. They were victims, entirely innocent of the nightmare that had descended upon their lives. The authorities had to pivot back to the physical evidence, no matter how scarce it was. A glimmer of hope emerged when a search grid yielded a promising discovery. Approximately 2 miles away from the quiet suburban crime scene, discarded in the harsh desert brush, investigators found a pair of black gloves. To the naked eye, they appeared to be a perfect match for the dark gloves worn by the phantom captured in the Pamber proper doorbell camera footage. The investigative team rushed the gloves to the state crime laboratory, praying that the suspect had made a fatal error by discarding them in a rush to escape. They hoped to extract trace DNA, sweat, or skin cells that could generate a profile and put a name to the masked face. The tension in the precinct was palpable as they waited for the results. But forensic science is a cruel and impartial judge. When the laboratory results finally returned, the DNA profile extracted from the black gloves did not belong to a master criminal. The genetic markers matched a completely innocent local restaurant worker who had reportedly simply lost his winter gear while walking home from a late shift. It was a devastating dead end. The black gloves were nothing more than a heartbreaking coincidence, a physical red herring that had consumed valuable time and resources, while the trail of the actual suspect grew colder by the hour. Just as the physical investigation seemed to crash into a solid wall, the case took a bizarre and chaotic turn into the realm of cyberspace. The family began receiving terrifying communications. Dark, anonymous emails flooded their inboxes, claiming responsibility for the abduction and demanding a massive ransom. The alleged kidnappers demanded the payment be transferred entirely in Bitcoin, setting cold, rigid deadlines for the cryptocurrency transaction. The stakes were pushed to astronomical heights when the victim, daughter publicly offered a staggering $1 million reward for information leading to the safe return of her mother. The introduction of the $1 million bounty and the Bitcoin demands created an absolute nightmare for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They were suddenly forced to untangle a web of potential motives. Were these emails legitimately sent by the mastermind who disabled the camera and vanished into the night? Or were they dealing with opportunistic digital scavengers, cruel internet trolls, who saw a high-profile missing persons case and decided to torment a grieving family in the hopes of scoring a quick cryptocurrency payday? The digital noise was deafening, making it nearly impossible to hear the true signal of the investigation. The authorities were drowning in unverified threats and false leads, while the physical location of the 84-year-old woman remained an absolute mystery. Tell me your theory down in the comments below. Do you think the alleged anonymous Bitcoin ransom emails were sent by the actual kidnapper who planned this from the start? Or are they just a cruel distraction created by opportunistic scammers trying to steal the $1 million reward? As the physical trail completely evaporated into the desert dirt, the detectives realized they had to return to the invisible world. They had to look past the noisy emails and dig back into the silent, automated data logs of the victim herself. They knew that human beings can lie, and emails can be spoofed, but the raw binary data transmitted by medical devices does not have the capacity to deceive. The answer, they realized, was not going to be found in the desert brush or in a ransom note. It was going to be found in the microscopic digital handshake between a fragile human heart and a silicon microchip. The transformation of this baffling local mystery into an overwhelming national spectacle happened with terrifying speed. Because the victim was the mother of a highly prominent national television anchor who broadcasted to millions of viewers every single morning on a major network, the local jurisdiction was suddenly thrust under the microscopic and unforgiving scrutiny of the entire country. The regional sheriff department found themselves forced to navigate not only the incredibly complex logistics of a vanishing act, but also the relentless, crushing demands of the 24-hour international news cycle. The psychological devastation inflicted upon the relatives was exponentially magnified by the intensely public nature of their suffering. Every press conference was broadcasted live from coast to coast, turning their private nightmare into public consumption. However, this extraordinary level of visibility brought a new, far more insidious element into the investigation. When you broadcast a profound and desperate vulnerability to the entire world, you inevitably attract individuals who feed exclusively on the grief and desperation of others. The family quickly found themselves drowning in an absolute sea of malicious and opportunistic communications. They were forced to endure the agonizing process of deciphering which terrifying threats were genuine and which were cruel fabrications generated by anonymous actors, hiding safely behind encrypted international networks. The investigators quickly realized that relying on human intelligence and public tips in this chaotic, emotionally charged environment was a losing battle. People lie, people misremember crucial details, or they intentionally manipulate the truth for their own financial gain. The only incorruptible, objective witness left in this entire ordeal was the silent silicon and the complex code governing infrastructure of the victim's life. Federal authorities decided to shift their entire investigative strategy, pivoting away from the contaminated physical landscape and moving aggressively toward extracting the raw, unfiltered data held by multinational technology corporations. This bureaucratic process is incredibly tedious, frustratingly slow, and bound by massive legal hurdles. Federal warrants had to be meticulously drafted, officially signed by federal judges, and formally served to the highly fortified legal departments of these massive digital entities. Dedicated detectives sat in windowless command centers, staring intensely at blank monitors, waiting desperately for the digital gates to finally open. They knew with absolute certainty that somewhere deep within the fortified server farms of these tech giants, the exact sequence of the horrifying events was permanently etched in binary code. The tension in the incident command center was absolute and suffocating. The physical trail had evaporated completely into the arid landscape, leaving the seasoned investigators with nothing but the fragile hope that the automated machines had somehow captured what the human eye had completely missed. The transition from searching physical desert landscapes to traversing complex digital architectures requires a completely different type of investigative stamina and mental endurance. It is a silent, grueling, and deeply isolating pursuit of alphanumeric strings that represent the final, terrifying moments of an independent life. The silence of the physical crime scene was already deafening, but the anticipated roar of the incoming data packets promised to finally shatter the mystery and reveal the face of the phantom. They just had to wait for the distant servers to yield their deeply held secrets. The pressure from the highest levels of government and media demanded answers, but the machinery of the internet moves at its own indifferent pace. Every passing hour without physical evidence felt like a complete failure, pushing the entire task force closer to the brink of despair. They were entirely at the mercy of the data retrieval process, praying that the eventual data dump would provide the golden thread needed to unravel the perfect crime. The agonizing delay in receiving the subpoenaed server logs created a dangerous vacuum of information, a quiet valley of despair where theories multiplied and hope slowly began to wither. The detectives knew that whoever orchestrated this flawless extraction was incredibly disciplined, leaving behind zero biological material in the primary residence. The sheer professionalism of the abduction meant the perpetrator was likely monitoring the news coverage, watching the police chase shadows and false leads across the state. This realization brought a chilling sense of powerlessness to the precinct. They were playing a reactive game against an adversary who had perfectly anticipated their standard operational procedures. The entire case hung precariously on the assumption that the suspect had made a single, microscopic error in their digital footprint. As the days stretched on, the suffocating silence of the evidence room was broken only by the continuous ringing of the tip line, offering nothing but dead ends and manufactured sightings. The investigative team was starving for a verified fact, desperately needing the technology companies to deliver the timeline that would finally expose the mechanics of the midnight vanishing. When the massive encrypted files finally arrived from the corporate servers, the digital curtain was violently pulled back, allowing the timeline to resume in the dead of the Arizona night. The forensic analysts meticulously combed through the raw data, and what they discovered shattered the remaining illusions of safety. At exactly 2:12 in the morning, the sophisticated optical sensors mounted on the exterior of the property successfully registered a distinct anomaly. The hardware functioned perfectly, detecting an intrusion in the pitch-black environment and internally triggering a silent alarm within its own circuitry. But this is exactly where the modern promise of absolute residential security fatally and tragically collapses. The wide-angle lens saw the movement, the internal processor acknowledged the physical intrusion, but the entire system was crippled by a seemingly mundane administrative detail. There was no active, paid subscription for continuous cloud storage attached to the homeowner account. Because of this single financial oversight, the expensive camera acted merely as a fleeting mirror rather than a secure, permanent vault. It accurately reflected the horror of the moment, but retained absolutely no long-term memory of the event. The device captured the ghost moving through the shadows, but allowed it to slip effortlessly through its digital fingers. This agonizing revelation meant that for a fraction of a second, the global network was entirely aware of the predator navigating the property, but that critical awareness was instantly overwritten and permanently lost to the vast void of the internet. It was a devastating, crushing blow to the seasoned investigators, knowing with certainty that the visual evidence of the extraction existed for a fleeting moment before vanishing forever. However, the most chilling and absolute timestamp was yet to come. The ultimate peak of terror in this unprecedented investigation does not involve a loud physical confrontation, a recorded struggle, or a desperate cry for help. It is characterized by a completely silent, invisible, and irreversible rupture in the atmosphere. At exactly 2:28 in the morning, the continuous, rhythmic transmission of vital medical data abruptly and permanently stopped. The life-sustaining device surgically implanted in the chest of the 84-year-old woman lost its wireless connection to her designated smartphone. You must understand the profound, terrifying implications of this exact minute on the timeline. Wireless Bluetooth technology operates on a very strict, unforgiving, and highly limited physical radius. It requires close physical proximity between the internal transmitter and the external receiver to maintain the handshake of encrypted health data. When that vital signal unexpectedly dropped at 2:28 in the morning, it indicated a sudden physical separation that violently violated the secure boundaries of the home. That exact minute is the undeniable digital time of death for the crime scene itself. It is the precise, indisputable moment the victim was physically carried beyond the invisible electronic perimeter of her own sanctuary. The silence that followed this disconnection was absolute and terrifying. The machines permanently stopped talking to each other, marking the exact second she was swallowed entirely by the desert night. The realization hit the command center like a physical blow. They were no longer looking at a missing person's timeline. They were looking at the precise moment a human being was successfully smuggled out of a fortress, without triggering a single physical alarm. The sheer coordination required to move an elderly, medically fragile individual out of the structure, away from her devices, and into the darkness, exactly 16 minutes after the motion sensor was triggered, is staggering. It requires a terrifying level of confidence and a complete mastery of the environment. The detectives stared at the spreadsheet, displaying the 2:28 a.m. disconnection, fully comprehending the grim reality that the digital heartbeat of the house had flatlined. The invisible tether had been aggressively snapped, and the physical trail had officially ceased to exist. This was the exact moment the meticulously planned operation achieved its final, terrifying objective. The suspect had not only breached the physical perimeter and disabled the primary optical defenses, but they had also successfully isolated the target from the very technology designed to monitor her survival. The timestamp stands as a cold, unfeeling monument to the ultimate vulnerability of the human condition when pitted against a predator who understands the limitations of our electronic shields. The profound emptiness of the hours following that disconnection represents the darkest chapter of the investigation, a void where all forensic science completely surrenders to the unknown. The digital ghost had officially left the network, taking the victim into a realm where satellites and servers could no longer reach her. The terrifying revelation of the precise timeline completely altered the psychological profile of the unknown suspect. The authorities were forced to acknowledge that this was absolutely not a crime of sudden opportunity born out of a random, unfortunate encounter. The sheer precision required to navigate the unrecorded blind spots and extract a fragile human being without alerting a single neighbor requires meticulous, long-term planning. This realization forced the investigators to look backward, far beyond the terrifying events of that late January night. They began to aggressively dig into the weeks leading up to the disappearance, desperately searching for the hidden genesis of the nightmare. In a highly unusual move, the sheriff department issued an urgent and highly specific public plea to the surrounding community, begging anyone with relevant information to focus their memories on a very specific date. They asked the general public to think back to the night of January 11th, a full 20 days before the victim was ultimately taken from her residence. This targeted request sent a wave of profound, chilling unease through the entire community. It publicly confirmed the most terrifying theory the federal investigators held behind closed doors. The predator had been actively watching the property. The horrific events of the abduction night were merely the final execution of a sophisticated plan that had been quietly in motion for nearly 3 weeks. Someone had been relentlessly stalking the perimeter, observing the daily routines, mapping the structural vulnerabilities, and calculating the exact response times of the local security infrastructure. The suspect knew the exact layout of the property. The suspect knew the precise location of the exterior blind spots. Most chillingly, the suspect intimately knew the schedule of an 84-year-old woman living entirely alone. The horrifying idea that a masked figure had been lurking in the desert brush, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike, elevates the terror of this case to an entirely different, almost cinematic level. It abruptly transforms the affluent, peaceful neighborhood from a secure, safe haven into a designated hunting ground. The community was left grappling with the horrifying, unshakable thought that the monster was hiding in plain sight, carefully orchestrating a flawless abduction while they slept peacefully in their own beds nearby. Despite the massive allocation of federal resources and the intense national media scrutiny, the physical investigation remains agonizingly open. The massive financial reward remains completely unclaimed, sitting in a bank account while the family continues to suffer in an agonizing state of limbo. The agonizing questions continue to relentlessly haunt the dedicated detectives, who occasionally return to walk the empty, silent halls of the abandoned house. The physical trail remains absolutely cold, leaving behind a dark legacy of unanswered questions and a chilling reminder of our collective vulnerability. The ghost who stepped onto the porch that night managed to achieve the impossible, committing a highly complex crime in the modern era without leaving a single microscopic mistake. They walked into the digital web, severed the connections, and walked out with a human life, leaving the authorities to endlessly debate the true meaning of the silence they left behind. The mystery of January 11th remains the most haunting, unresolved puzzle piece in the entire dossier. What exactly happened on that specific winter night that tipped off the authorities to the surveillance phase of the operation? Was it a tripped perimeter alarm that was quickly dismissed as a stray animal, or a brief glimpse of a shadow caught on a distant dash cam? The authorities refuse to publicly elaborate on the exact nature of the evidence tied to that date, closely guarding the information as holdback evidence to verify any future confessions. This deliberate secrecy only deepens the profound sense of dread surrounding the timeline. It proves that the predator was incredibly patient, willing to invest weeks of unseen labor to guarantee the absolute success of the final extraction. The sheer dedication to the craft of abduction is what makes this unknown suspect one of the most terrifying figures in modern criminal history. When we objectively analyze the intricate mechanics of this incredibly sophisticated abduction, a profound and terrifying lesson emerges regarding the modern illusion of residential safety. We currently invest heavily in the physical hardware of security, proudly mounting expensive cameras to our exterior walls and attaching complex sensors to our doors, genuinely believing these plastic and glass totems will project an impenetrable force field around our vulnerable families. However, this specific investigation starkly demonstrates that physical hardware is entirely useless if the data it collects is not properly secured and permanently stored in an off-site cloud facility. A surveillance camera that only monitors the environment but fails to actively record the footage is nothing more than a digital scarecrow, easily bypassed by a dedicated predator who fundamentally understands its technical limitations. Furthermore, what this case teaches us about the grim future of home invasion is that society is no longer merely defending against blunt force trauma and shattered glass. We are now actively forced to defend our personal networks against sophisticated digital ghosts who know exactly how to blind. Our electronic watchdogs, long before they ever step foot onto the physical property. The modern predator studies network latency, connection radiuses, and subscription service tiers with the exact same intensity they once used to study the mechanical locks on our front doors. Our increasing dependence on interconnected smart devices has inadvertently created a vast new landscape of residential vulnerability, permanently shifting the criminal battleground from the physical threshold to the invisible radio frequencies that constantly surround us. The legal system and our standard law enforcement response protocols are currently struggling to adapt to this terrifying reality. We must fundamentally reevaluate how we define a secure perimeter in an era where the most dangerous weapons are used to sever invisible connections rather than break physical barriers. The sudden, violent disappearance of an 84-year-old woman leaves behind a haunting legacy defined entirely by the silent data she could not take with her. Her physical form vanished completely into the unforgiving darkness of the open desert, but her final digital footprint remains perfectly preserved in a frozen, terrifying state of violent interruption. We are constantly left staring at the terrifying, unexplainable void between a severed Bluetooth connection and a completely empty house. This unresolved case forces all of us to critically question the very nature of our modern security and the fragile, invisible threads that tie us to the outside world. But what exactly happens when the advanced technology, designed to meticulously protect us, is completely subverted and weaponized by a predator to orchestrate an even more sinister and complex crime? In our next deep dive investigation, we will thoroughly uncover a truly baffling case where the digital evidence did not just quietly record a sudden disappearance, but actively participated in a highly orchestrated and deadly deception. Make sure you hit the subscribe button right now and turn on all notifications to immediately unlock the next incredibly dark chapter hidden inside our ongoing archives.